Hello everyone, today we talk about the Corvées, so the free work performances that some peasants were owed in the Dominicum, that is to say in the agrarian farm that the lord, we're talking about the seigneurial or manorial system, whatever you want to call it, in fact owned, where in fact mostly the Massari as free peasants, so those who depended on the land plots were rented by the same lord too. And these freemen were to be carried out for free, right? In fact, this is the most important feature of the same that contract that shows naturally within the seigneurial system the preeminence that the seigneurial power had acquired in many ways. Just yesterday we were talking about this aspect relatively to the emergence properly of the lordships in Europe post-Carolingian times from the side of properly war bands, right? Military, actually something more than that. So military bands, something that had become properly professional. It was becoming professional in nature at that point, and that ensured by deterrence and active force a form of order in a world where this order had collapsed as far as the public royal and imperial authority were concerned for an important amount of time, where lots of peasants had sought a refuge in, fundamentally giving up part of their personal freedom in exchange for protection. And naturally, this was an agricultural system, like the pre-industrial world, and the socio-economical dimension is to be understood on that base. So we can't read this from a political military point of view, we can read this from a social economical point of view. And the Corvées would become essentially the standard, like a free work performance. So in later centuries, during the full Middle Ages, that would see actually and notoriously an increase of seigneurial and feudal power over the peasantry. In other words, peasants were much freer in the High Middle Ages than they were in the Late Middle Ages or the Early Modern Age, for that matter. But the mechanism began at this point, right? It had always existed in a way. I mean, you can't trace it back to the Roman latifundium, to the early medieval Germanic lordships as well. I mean, the freemen had increasingly lost power, and these systems actually already existed. In fact, in Merovingian Gaul, as eventually and more largely in Carolingian Europe, where the system spread with the Frankish conquests, and would come to define, in fact, most of the land exploitation forms that were, in fact, based also on this literally free working performance that kind of concretely embodied the upper hand that the lords had on the peasantry, and the necessity that the peasantry had to live also like that, because in that free performance was actually a lot of protection that, as you understand, by working on the Dominicum was being fueled directly in the means that the lords would use to defend the surrounding peasants that worked on the plots outside of their in fact manorial area. And the etymology also of Corvées, Corvariae was called, it came from the late Latin corrugata, that is properly the work, right, per se. So this eventually what we know it in French mostly because that came to be a hallmark properly of the Western Frankish system, from which eventually the feudalism would have developed in its more formalized, updated way that was also with the greatest success and greater economical drive, etc. So this system was actually effective, and as we will see, of course, it was not just a pure one, because when we study the seigneurial system, we made lots of videos on it. We tendentially explain it for didactic sake, actually, for being clear, because the situation was much more complex, and for at least for the young students can be confusing not to get it in simpler terms. But of course, this was not just the only agricultural and kind of allegedly closed or highly hierarchized and, you know, stagnating system that the older historiography thought it was, right? It was a completely different thing, not just because it was an open system, it was still somewhat unstable, and the same and these same means were contributing to stabilize it, but also because it was in continuous expansion. I mean, this is the system from which eventually what we call the European rebirth was achieved, and the West literally boomed in ways that really are not to be found, that I know, in relative terms, in any other historical reality, right? Because in terms of, say, in conditions of symmetry, we could say not even the Industrial Revolution actually spiked in that, considering the means that were used, again, in proportional terms, the way high medieval Europe did through the same order. So the Corvées had also an important function for the lightening of the administrative apparatus of each seigneurial, fiscal, agricultural farm. That is to say, you know how it began, tendentially, right? These were, at least in theory, since the foundation of the Merovingian kingdom, and it was in all Romano-Germanic kingdoms. I mean, the idea was that the king basically owned everything except those areas where fundamentally the freemen had settled, but there was still an ambiguity about that, because they never had really the strength to dislodge them from there. But at the same time, everything in theory was kind of considered like a private possession of the king, and kind of overlapping with that public authority that the king exercised. This is especially true in the Frankish world, right? In other areas, like among the Longobards, the Visigoths, it was kind of a greater sense of the older public order of Roman legacy, whereas in the Merovingian, Carolingian world, everything was really private. So what would have been the man was really seen like a personal possession of the monarchic lineage at that point. In any case, there was, in this sense, an enormous amount of land that was namely public, the domain, in fact, and it was very often, in fact, in this post-Roman Europe, overlapping with what had been the fiscus lands. That is to say, those, in fact, public lands were often also used for the maintaining, supplying of the army, the annona, as it was back in the day. And they were some of the most productive, also the best organized, right? The Franks basically encompassed a still functioning Gallo-Roman reality, where especially along the Belgian frontier, where the Romans for centuries had developed massive estates to supply the imposing military that they had deployed on the Rhine frontier. So now the Franks were there, and they inherited largely these enormous estates that in Gaul didn't really suffer any major disruption, let's say, as opposed to other lands in the West where the latifundium had collapsed. In France, this has not happened. So that's a great part of the reason why the seigneurial system started from there. And this land, eventually, these public lands were surely subcontracted to others, and it's the vassalitic beneficiary system and all. But the theory and the practice was that these lands had to produce a lot of wealth, right? So there was an administrative apparatus, because the enormous agricultural resources, especially Gaul had in the wide Atlantic plains, and that had in fact supplied great part of what being in fact the Merovingian and the Carolingian empires. Right? They were really massive also because of this enormous base of support resources that they could afford, and that were very well organized, right, with very advanced, sophisticated means for the times and places. So it's from here. I made lots of videos about this. Actually, if you're interested, I'm going to create a seigneurial system playlist. Made a lot of videos also in the passage from the late Roman villa to the early medieval curtis. So in Europe also we have different names according to this. We call it manorial system, the seigneurial system, the courtly system, depending on the national historiographies. It's basically the same. And it's very well documented. We made videos also on this in areas like mostly northern France and northern Italy. Like that's basically it. It's Neustria and Lombardy, because these were essentially the most productive lands in Carolingian Europe. They were better organized. They were different in the form of land management in many ways. The most typical model is the one of northern France. But they are the ones that are also comparable because they were so productive that they also produced more administrative, more documents, right, about their own administration. These are known famously in mediavistics as the Carolingian polyptychs, or inventories. They mostly stemmed also from the great abbeys, right, because they had even, the church had even a better administration than the lay aristocracy. So we are very lucky to get some of these info, because for the other areas we really don't know, right? We have to base ourselves on very indirect evidence, and it's basically impossible by a certain degree. In any case, we have an idea thanks to this polyptychs how they generally worked. And this work performance was essentially perfection as a system, because it came to be just spontaneously in the forms of land exploitation, and it substantiated itself, as we've seen, in the obligation of the massari, that is, those freemen actually, who lived in the lands owned by the lord but that were rented. Normally you see these drawings in the history books where you see the Dominicum is the part of the dominus of the lord in the center, and the massarium in the outer side, in the outskirts. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that, because especially in the areas with more active economy, this land plots could be really disarticulated. It could be even tens or hundreds of kilometers away from each other, right? Meaning in a part of, at least of the largest seigneuries, naturally. In some other cases, it could be something like that. So the corvée was the obligation of the massari of not limiting themselves to bring up the regular yearly annual census in nature to the lord. So this was normally a remarkable quota of products, or a kind of fixed quantity, or part in nature, part in money, because at this point also monetary economy did exist, and especially in these realities, to the villicus that lived in the manorial reserve, so the guy that administered the Dominicum. But more than that, to bring, in fact, to actually go there physically and periodically in the Dominicum, in the seigneurial reserve, for some days of the week, or even some weeks of the year, to work, to offer their work as integration of the agricultural work that the slaves of the reserve, so what were known in Latin as the servi or the mancipia, carried out there, right? So this work performance were the Corvariae or the Corvées. So this distinction is interesting because you see essentially there is seigneurial reserve, that is also usually the better the one that is infrastructurally better served, because it's where, not necessarily where the Lord lives, because he could have multiple curtes like that, but even the term is, here stressed, depending on how you want to call them, it's properly, there was a fence around that. It was often a wall, maybe even a moat, right? So there was some garrison. The villicus that was there locally was basically an administrator, was put by the lord there. Maybe the lord lived there in the castle, in the dungeon, with his familia and his that is, in fact, his retinues, armed retinues. And the villicus was the guy that basically was proposed at the administration of the land plots that were within the curtes, right? So on the Dominicum. And this land was characterized by the fact that those who inhabited it normally were serfs, were slaves, were non-freemen, right? And so they were kind of more directly under the lord's control. This doesn't even mean that they had it worse, right? Actually, during the seigneurial system, we have seen it many times. The serfs sometimes were actually living better than freemen, because being so close to the lord, maybe the lord, kind of had a good, good plans for them. Some of these people would become the next nobility at some point, because also in practice would check the status of a person in that regard. They could enter the retinues, could be entrusted, in fact, the administration of these curtes, and then maybe the lord died, or they autonomized themselves, and they were provided with, some kind of hereditary custom for their sons to administrate the place on behalf of the lord. So these would become maybe vicecomites, viscounts, because maybe the lord was a comes, was a count in the let's say in the district, in the establishment of the kingdom, and they could at some point become nobility themselves, maybe counts, fully counts. This would take a long time, under generations, but the fidelity here was quite important. But this was substantiated, of course, in the direct control that the lord had on these people. And actually, given that they were serfs, the lord could exact more, more from them. They weren't paid. And they weren't paid, as we will see now, also because the lord actually provided for them. That is to say, they were not, slaves that said, work this land and just, I don't care how you survive. No, the lord on the Dominicum would provide for the lodging, the supply, so these people lived effectively in part on the shoulders of the same lord. And you can't think that the Dominicum and the Massarism had any substantial the difference in terms of crop productivity. So they were basically facing the same I'd say similar land management in practice. And in general, considering the fact that the curtes, as we've seen, was also kind of often a fortified thing, was the place where, by the way, all the reserves were stocked, were the best infrastructurally served areas, because very often, in fact, the lords had greater capitals. They could invest in that, on the fortification, maybe on a mill, of course, these curtes were built on some kind of, with some broader logic, politically, strategically, but especially they were like the hardcore where the lord exercised his power from. So it was obvious, that we were saying before, that all the peasants were sought for protection, for some kind of protection, even though maintaining their own personal freedom from the outside, would tend to orbit, to gravitate around the curtes. I made a video, for example, about the importance of the seigneurial reserves during the seigneurial system, because of the caresties, of the famines, of the raids that, as we've seen, were quite often. I mean, yes, that's the problem of being a freeman out there. These were theoretically people who had land plots outside, even in full possession. I mean, maybe they had some plot there that bordered just the one that instead was of the lords and that they rented. But they were individual families. it's not that they could oppose themselves to, I don't know, normally at least they could. I mean, as we've seen, the peasantry was at this point dramatically violent and aggressive and dangerous and capable in that regard to even have a contract with the lords. But I mean, if the next masnata of, heavily armored horsemen was coming to raid, and so they didn't have like a Motte and Bailey castle for each family. So it's obvious that there was an agreement of some sort that when these events happened, or simply, the harvest went wrong, etc., the Lord could intervene. In fact, the Corvées were connected in part to the fact that, of course, the surplus that these people were working for, the Dominicum for, would be stored in the seigneurial reserve, so that in case of chaos or enemy attack, etc., these people could simply use the seigneurial reserves or to entrench themselves into the seigneurial curtis. And so there was some degree of cooperation. It was the same one for which negotially had brought to the Massari to exist in the first place, so to accept to work and live on a certain amount of land. And so there was no rule regarding, like in any contract, like these people were not, in theory, were not obliged to do anything. They were freemen. But they would kind of agree to be obliged to work for free, in part, because they knew that still that was somewhat advantageous for themselves through the Lord's power. So complex relations that show, of course, the need in the 10th, 11th century to also stay sharp, to be prudent, to be, to think about your own future in times, as we've seen, where this was not really to be given too much for granted, even on the short run, and that would bring to the expansion of seigneurial power through this. Right, so it was actually more remunerative for the Lord in proportion most of the times and its seigneury on a massaricium rather than on a Dominicum. You understand what I mean? I mean that rather than simply consolidating an area where you just have serfs that depend on you, it's fruitful to expand, broadly speaking, your power on extended areas that you don't have to literally maintain or protect directly all the time, because these are in theory just freemen, but that in general are more, right, are just to be found out there in many ways. Of course, there were many overlapping on different seigneuries in the process, so it was an extremely complicated thing you want to even imagine. I personally never studied these things in detail, but I've given a look to it. It's a freaking mess, right? But for the sake, again, of clarity, we tend to simplify it, narrowing it down to these concepts that were, however, all overlapping. And so it was easier for the Lord to exploit his power by profiting on this free work performance that was done on his Dominicum, so on the land that he directly controlled, and that was, in the sense, more qualitative and kind of the core of his own power. As you understand, in this process, the relation between the Dominicum and the Massaricium became economically quite intimate, and it demonstrated the particular attention that the Lord had, as we just said, for the reserve, in front of which the Massari had a subordinated function. The censuses in nature or in money were just a further seigneurial profit compared to the fundamental one that from the Massari the Lord expected through their work performance on the reserve. And the mansus that was granted to for work to the Massarius and his family was configured principally as the remuneration for the periodical cooperation that he gave, eventually together with some other member of his family, to the reserve production. And certainly, in those days in which the Massarius worked on the Dominicum, he was maintained on it. Right? This is, important. I mean, as we've seen, it could even this work performance could last for weeks even, because there were those times of the year. I mean, think about those seasonal activities that you had to carry out intensively in that specific moment, continuously, like, I don't know, the sowing, the same harvest, the vintage, all these things, and that for which these peasants, again freemen, went to literally live in the Dominicum. So there was a lodging, there was a supply provided by the Lord for them. So in a way, in that moment, they were maintained as the serfs. And so also the Lord, of course, invested his own capital there. It was not just exploiting this free labor for nothing. And they were, again, both doing it to a common profit, right? If you do something that, you know, I mean, capitalism is fantastic. You can't really you can't control anybody's mind, right? People are you gotta give them something in return. Right, and especially in this time in history where the political control is very loose, right? The fact that these bonds were formed tells you how necessary they were and how profitable they were for all. We've seen there was probably an iron logic to the system, because again, the risk of failing here and getting killed and dying and starving, whatever, was enormous. So you couldn't really kid around. Like, all the social roles were properly designed on this base, right? Every kind of activity was not really an option or a matter of personal opinion or radical emotional subjectivism like people today, because they're effectively not pressured by anything if not their own insignificance. People at the time gave an actually pretty good damn assessment of reality for what it was, as it was unfolding under their eyes. So it largely worked to mutual benefit in the end, even if it was unequal at some level. And tendentially, the lords would gain the upper hand, but it was not always the case. And this aspect is important because the rest of the year, the rest of the time, the Massarius had to maintain himself by himself on his manses. And he didn't have just to maintain himself. He had to maintain his children, I mean those who couldn't work yet, the elderly, the women of the family, and sometimes also one or two slaves that depended on the Massarius for the cultivation of the land plot, of the manses. And this shows you how the deal was, and that's properly a seigneurial, that's properly a hierarchy, right? Because there is a freeman, there are serfs of the freeman, they're the lords, they're kind of more powerful than the others, but it's in theory still an agreement among freemen, but still one freeman is, more affluent than the other, and so gives job to others. It's just like today. I mean, there's really nothing wrong about that. And then there is a higher system, a public one, even if still largely dysfunctional in these centuries, but still that was being fueled by this order, was being built from the bottom and from at a local level, right? So higher authorities, the counts, the kings, the emperor at some point. And so there was a deeper concern, because the Massarius still had kind of his own little Curtis to work on his own as a lord on his own mansion, his own household, right? So this is particularly remarkable. Consider that that variation I was talking about before, about going against the stereotype that I have told you, that this was an obscure system in a dark age where was this terrible evil lords who morbidly obese, laughing and eating like pigs over a pile of gold, while the poor peasants outside were starving to death and eating his leftovers. It's not really a historical reality, and very often, especially in certain areas, like northern Italy, you were saying before, the lords were just, in fact, they were freemen in the sense that they also weren't really necessarily noblemen. in many ways. Maybe they were just merchants, or they were richer peasants that made the big money for the reactivation international trade in Europe at the time, were maybe living in the city. So the thing is much more dynamic than it seems. It is. There would be some communes that would be born out of villagers sticking together, kind of forming a town, and maybe even managing to exert some power on the lords in the countryside, right? Not extremely frequent as a model, but it did happen too. So it really depends on the situation. So the villicus, so this lord's administrator that was entrusted with the land management of the seigneurial reserve, could count on a larger manpower of that he had to permanently organize on the same reserve, because again they had all these people who came from the Massarium to work there, for which of course the villicus had provided something that time. It wasn't all the time, it was just a smaller part of the time. And especially the villicus also didn't have to organize the broader lodging and supplies of those families of the workers of the Massari that had a land plot in concession. Because again, a Massarius could come there. I mean, surely some Massari would simply go there, like, because maybe they live just out of the Curtis, they would just work there in the day and go to sleep back home. But some lived properly there. But when they did that, they didn't come there with all their families, right? Which is different for the serfs of the Dominicum that lived there with their families and did have some autonomy themselves. I mean, think about the peculiar. I mean, historically speaking, on a juridical point of view, the slaves were technically allowed to have some kind of possession, right? Of course, it didn't count anything if the master said, no, that's mine. But they had, and in practice here we're talking about, yes, slaves are turning into serfs, turning into something else, sometimes even. So that depended, but it was, of course, the Lord's interest for these people to be satisfied, to live in Dominicum, to have something to live for, and to accumulate also some autonomy, because, of course, they weren't paid. Those were working Corvées all their lives, but they were maintained entirely. Their families were maintained, and they were also, as we've seen, maintained within very often a very good place, right? You're in a safer place than the one the freemen lived outside the Curtis very often. So that was kind of a good deal, right? Again, I sympathized with them, and they would know how to exploit. And the same goes for the Massari that knew their own deal, and they accepted the Corvées because it was evident that such mechanism really was beneficial for their own future as well, right? And so naturally, in at least if we consider this model in a fixed way, that again was not the case, and we consider this asymmetry between those who went to work for free, that had to maintain their own families, where the local administrators of the Dominican didn't, because the Lord, at that point was more powerful, could impose that on the former. At the parity of land, of yield, etc., the Dominican would produce more. Not because of the soil area, but because there were more people working on there, and they weren't even paid. So the Dominican was more profitable in that regard. Again, it was more profitable because just the lords were even themselves investing, literally themselves, their lives there in Columity, in fighting, protecting the surrounding freemen that decided to be under them as a clientele. And that also has a cost. And again, the Massarius that is growing ever less warlike, because generally speaking, especially in places like Gaul, Italy, that were places that where things worked in a bit more of a comprehensive fashion, and the people didn't really need to be, on alert every single time, even though it was still a dramatically brutal war. But let's say, as you know, feudalism would bring, like, the peasant is just a peasant, and the bellator, the knight, is just a fighter properly as such. So, especially in France, this is true. This is enormous mass. As we were saying before, the latifundium had remained, right? So, the disarmament of the people was kind of evident, right? And it had become properly fruitful for the same people, because, again, if you want to be in the heartland of the Carolingian Empire that brings under, subdues all the peoples around, it turned out that it was more rationally and organized, and therefore more effectively and advantageous to have a much more hierarchically and functionally and better organized system like that one, when you had literally a lot of labor force concentrating for providing the ultra military elite of Europe in the form of heavily armored horsemen that mostly cost not much because of the absolute cost of the horse, of the purchase of horse or weapons and armor, but because the lords literally fight the entire life. So you have literally to pay for the supply. Literally all the calories were spent by horses, by the lords, to train over and over and over and over and over and over again, to develop that collective training that would smash like everybody, any other people in Europe out there. For what? For the peasants that lived in those places to be, to have this enormously deterrent force that wouldn't let any other people messing around with their lords. So naturally, this was done. We have commented much on the Carolingian, like in the Gallo-Roman Frankish world, and how the Merovingian Carolingian legacy expanded from it. It was also a world of abuse. I mean, I don't want to make it really too bright as a situation, because of course there was a vicious oppression and violence and imposition and injustice in all this, but like the entire world worked like that. There weren't really other ways but these ones actually to improve the situation. And of course the Corvées were like an insult, because these high medieval peasants were still kind of reminiscent of their early medieval or ancient status of freemen that were, literally every freeman was a nobleman because they had the right to bear arms. And now they were seeing that there was this massively engineered, professional military system nobody had ever seen in the tribal world, that was emerging in a seigneurial sense. It was basically expoliating the freemen of their own dignity, because they were essentially disarming them, and this equated to essentially emasculating them and saying they were properly subhuman beings, and because they couldn't even put up a fight, let's be honest, against the heavily armored cavalry, at least most of the times, and things were going not definitely the other way around as a trend. So again, it was brutal, but at the same time it was functional, because Europe, and this is simply showed by the fact that Europe was skyrocketing, and that altogether these countries would be the ones that would become more advanced and richer, and even more civilized, and kind of with a higher quality of life in the process. So is feudalism a positive thing? Yes. Yeah, it's generally speaking, like in the moment in which you don't consider it in a classistic parasitic sense, where you think that it's just exploitation, but you see that there's an actual point that these seigneurial reserves were used for developing longer range trade, traffics, international relations, consolidate, organizing, rationalizing, pacifying, civilizing. Well, that's exactly the point. Everybody seeks that on the longer term. The human civilization is built like that. So again, one has to be honest about the realities there, right? It's difficult to compare some realities sometimes, and personal freedom is not necessarily the indicator of that, because if you objectively are if you're just less resourceful as an individual, it's not really a good thing for the rest. But in that sense, you should at least obey towards people that are to understand the benefit deriving from a broader expansion. And that's, again, why these places kind of evolved further, right? Even if you take the French Revolution, that stemmed from French absolutism that had made France the largest power and one of the most advanced countries in the world. So that the idea, again, that there is just a spin-off toward exploitation, it's not really the case, and that depends on the culture as well. You have ferocious regimes where there are just oligarchs and the people are like shit, and those really are not the best societies. But that's also a matter of stupidity. Like, there is properly a dimension of moral force and intelligence and development that, again, mostly display that change in countries that are poorer and less developed, whereas the most advanced tend to maintain more easily that balance and understanding because the individuals are more endowed with that sense of empowerment that allows them to positively participate to the order. So these are my digressions on kind of the broader outlook. But let's say it's evident how the seigneurial system was evidently the result of a rational process, like of a balance that was reached with awareness in the management of the seigneurial and fiscal agrarian farms after a series of experiments, regular centuries long, were imitations among the great landowners, by the way, that were at that point also, yes, kind of competing among each other, but exactly because of that competition, that ferocious competition and bloodshed sometimes, that's still kind of developing the whole freaking system further as ever more advanced and ever more kind of like sharing the know-how, the knowledge, the means, the administrative capacities, etc., to see, and also to see properly the value, the positive value of cooperation. At the same time, it was a precarious balance because the dynamism of the land assets, and that reveals still the fruitfulness of the system, because still by increasing productivity, there was an increase of opportunities for example, successory divisions, the inheritances, donations, purchases, right? There were places, especially, in Lombardy, where people literally built motte-and-bailey castles to sell them, not to use them for themselves, because there was such a florid market. Also, flow of monetary economy at that point from never been seen from centuries, that people just would do that and say, okay, it was an extremely dynamic thing, and that's why you can't really trace even on a map satisfactorily the boundaries of such agrarian these estates, because they were scattered sometimes, again, very far. They could be, and they were, by the way, not even just lands. They could be just rights on certain specific places. It could be cannons, could be tolls, other forms of exaction, so that you didn't even own the land or had any management, but by contract you are owed a fraction of the income. And all Europe was like this. Post-Carolingian Europe, and it was a dramatically advanced system that was perfecting all those mechanisms that in the following centuries were bringing actually to more literacy, to more trade, to the development of cities, because of all this massive advancement and hierarchical and organized direction of land exploitation in ever more rationalized directions that required a much larger competition, a much larger scale interaction in international relations, and that looked, in fact, at very far trades there, because especially the fuel system was also naturally developing an elite, right? Some nobiliar luxury products, for example, as are the ones that normally travel more far than the others, and also come from very far away, transcontinental trade as well. That again, for these times, you don't really, you don't really think, this was such an open system. It actually was, right? And again, the way we have come to describe this in, to present this in popular culture has not really been quite a fair one most of the time. In any case, we will keep talking about the seigneurial system. It's a very important topic, right? I created a Post-Carolingian playlist because, again, sometimes I make videos, and like if it's not about like a thumbnail with a map and in the name some kind of ethnic or fetish or other fetish stuff that you like it's either specifically the migration era or the Byzantines, you don't even click on it. And it's quite frustrating, but these actually are the single most important things that you can't learn those things if you don't understand what the system really was, right? And that really speaks for the narrowing down properly of any kind of historical understanding, or any form of understanding actually that we're witnessing today, in a sort of fortistatization of the land, where literally people give up their own individual strength for saying, okay, I will depend on something else and some cheaper ideas and thinking, and I will make my world smaller and smaller, so I will have to fatigue less and less. Yes, and it will accomplish less and less. In the process, it will fall under the next feudal lord, right? That's not going to be positive for you. It's just going to be positive for those who will rightfully exploit you. I mean, you cannot understand the Middle Ages if you don't understand these things, or if you don't care about this thing, or if you think that, yes, it's that kind of idea, but no. Because that kind of idea you've never heard. These things nobody talks about on the internet. I'm possibly the only person who does this, and who insists a lot on it, because knows how vital they are. You know that I'm about politics and war, and I'm not much for a socioeconomic approach to history in general, because I think it's been overrated. But let's say without this, you can't understand the other either. You have to face that. I faced it constantly as a medievalist. You can't really say, no, I don't care. I don't care how this mechanism happened, because if you don't know how that mechanism happened, how can you understand all the system? I mean, the system was literally based on this mechanism. So if you don't understand that, how can you understand politics or war? It's not an option. History is not sectorially intelligible, right? And that's where the worst kind of misunderstandings really happen. Even for when I make medieval Christianity playlist, I see video, you don't even click on it. Sometimes brutally. So like I make multiple hundreds of views, single videos if it's about, the Germanic migrations, or, look at this, map with the duchy, with this people, this name, this power. And then you make a video about, Humberto Roman, what the hell, there's the figure of a Dominican. I don't give a shit about that. How can you understand the Middle Ages if you don't understand that? I mean, seriously, I tell you, as what I do in my life, to which point I study medieval history for. And I can't. I'm the person who, if you come to university, I'll make exams to you. So, and I make lessons to you. And the question there is, how can I let you pass if you don't know these things? I mean, and this is factually the point. Why do you listen to just to those topics and not those ones, and hope to, have any kind of understanding about medieval history? Again, it doesn't work. If you don't know that thing, you can't understand the other. There's no way out of that. I can't promise you as a historian. As in anything else in life, by the way, you can't really live your life sectorially and pretending that, only what satisfies your incompleteness and fuels it further is what you need in life. It's quite the opposite. And I do care about this too, because again, I don't want to become a meme like the guy who tells medieval history. I want to make people understand things, which is a completely different thing. And again, I know that everybody comes here, I can't select the background, it's against my own interest. But the point is evident, right? I mean, law doesn't admit ignorance. If you don't know what I'm doing here, please check out, because otherwise you will basically not understand anything from what this is, and you will not be able to understand what the whole channel is about. And it's a problem for you, because it's all time and energies that you lose for getting nothing. It's a very stupid investment. Like, you could spend the same by making per 10 income, and you still make 1. That's really not very profitable. In any case, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.